Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to subscribe for more. The Married Couple by Franz Kafka. Business in general is so bad that sometimes, when my work in the office leaves me a little time, I myself pick up the case of samples and call on my customers personally. Long since I had intended to visit sometime, among others, N, with whom once I had constant business relations, which, however, during the last year have almost completely lapsed for some reason unknown to me. Besides, there need not always be real reasons for such disruptions. In the present unstable state of affairs, often a mere nothing, a mood, will turn the scale, and in the same way a mere nothing, a word, can put things right again. To gain admittance to N, however, is a somewhat ticklish business. He is an old man, grown somewhat infirm too of late, and though he still insists on attending to business matters himself, he is hardly ever to be seen in his office. If you want to speak to him you have to go to his house, and one likes to put off a business call of that kind. Last evening after 6 I nevertheless set out for his house. It was really no time for paying calls, but my visit after all was a business, not a social one, and might be regarded accordingly. I was in luck. N was in, he had just come back with his wife from a walk, the servant told me, and was now in the bedroom of his son, who was unwell and confined to his bed. I was requested to go there. At first I hesitated, but then the desire to get my disagreeable visit over as quickly as possible turned the scale, and I allowed myself to be conducted as I was, in my overcoat and hat, with my case of samples, through a dark room into a faintly lit one, where a small company was gathered. My first glance fell, probably by instinct, on an agent only too well known to me, a trade rival of myself in some respects. So he had stolen a march on me, it seemed. He was sitting comfortably by the bed of the sick man, just as if he were a doctor. He sat there brazenly in his beautiful ample overcoat, which was unbuttoned. The sick man too probably had his own thoughts as he lay there with his cheeks faintly flushed with fever, now and then glancing at his visitor. He was no longer young either, N.'s son, a man of about my own age with a short beard, somewhat unkempt on account of his illness. Old N, a tall, broad-shouldered man, but to my astonishment grown very thin because of some creeping malady, bent and infirm, was still wearing the fur coat in which he had entered, and mumbling something to his son. His wife, small and frail, but immensely vivacious, yet only when she spoke to him, us others she scarcely noticed, was occupied in helping him to take off his overcoat, which, considering the great difference in their height, was a matter of some difficulty, but at last was achieved. Perhaps, indeed, the real difficulty was caused by N.'s impatience, for with restless hands he kept on feeling for the easy chair, which his wife, after the overcoat was off, quickly pushed forward for him. She herself then took up the fur coat, beneath which she almost vanished, and carried it out. Now at last, it seemed to me, my moment had come, or rather it had not come and probably would never come, yet if I was to attempt anything it must be done at once, for I felt that here the conditions for a business interview could only become increasingly unfavorable, and to plant myself down here for all time, as the agent apparently intended, was not my way. Besides, I did not want to take the slightest notice of him. So I began without ceremony to state my business, although I saw that N would have liked at that moment to have a chat with his son. Unfortunately I have a habit when I have worked myself up, and that takes a very short time, and on this occasion took a shorter time than usual, of getting up and walking about while I am talking. Though a very good arrangement in one's own office, in a strange house it may be somewhat burdensome. But I could not restrain myself, particularly as I was feeling the lack of my usual cigarette. Well, every man has his bad habits, yet I can congratulate myself on mine when I think of the agent's. For what is to be said of his behavior, of the fact, for instance, that every now and then he would suddenly and quite unexpectedly clap his hat on his head, he had been holding it on his knee until then, slowly pushing it up and down there. True, he took it off again immediately, as if he had made a blunder, but he had had it on his head nevertheless for a second or two, and besides he repeated this performance again and again every few minutes. Surely such conduct must be called unpardonable. It did not disturb me, however. I walked up and down, completely absorbed in my own proposals, and ignored him, but there are people whom that trick with the hat might have put off completely. However, when I am thoroughly worked up I disregard not only such annoyances as these, but everything. I see, it is true, all that is going on, but do not admit it, so to speak, to my consciousness until I am finished, or until some objection is raised. Thus I noticed quite well, for instance, that N was by no means in a receptive state. Holding on to the arms of his chair, he twisted about uncomfortably, never even glanced up at me, but gazed blankly, as if searching for something, into vacancy, and his face was so impassive that one might have thought no syllable of what I was saying, indeed no awareness of my presence, had penetrated to him. Yes, his whole bearing, the bearing of a sick man, in itself inauspicious for me, I took in quite well. Nevertheless I talked on as if I had still some prospect of putting everything right again by my talk, by the advantageous offers I made. I was myself alarmed by the concessions I granted, concessions that had not even been asked for. It gave me a certain satisfaction also to notice that the agent, as I verified by a fleeting glance, had at last left his hat in peace and folded his arms across his chest. My performance, which was partly, I must confess, intended for him, seemed to have given a severe blow to his designs. And in the elation produced by this result I might perhaps have gone on talking for a long time still, if the son, whom until now I had regarded as a secondary factor in my plans, had not suddenly raised himself in his bed and pulled me up by shaking his fist. Obviously he wanted to say something, to point out something, but he had not strength enough. At first I thought that his mind was wandering, but when I involuntarily glanced at old N, I understood better. N sat with wide open, glassy, bulging eyes, which seemed on the point of failing. He was trembling and his body was bent forward as if someone were holding him down or striking him on the shoulders. His lower lip, indeed the lower jaw itself with the exposed gums, hung down helplessly. His whole face seemed out of joint. He still breathed, though with difficulty, but then, as if released, he fell back against the back of his chair, closed his eyes, the mark of some great strain passed over his face and vanished, and all was over. I sprang to him and seized his lifeless hand, which was so cold that it sent a chill through me. No pulse beat there now. So it was all over. Still, he was a very old man. We would be fortunate if we all had such an easy death. But how much there was to be done. And what should one do first? I looked around for help, but the son had drawn the bedclothes over his head, and I could hear his wild sobbing. The agent, cold as a fish, sat immovably on his chair, 2 steps from N, and was obviously resolved to do nothing, to wait for what time would bring. So I was left to do something, and the hardest thing that anyone could be asked to do. That was to tell the news to his wife in some bearable form, in a form that did not exist, in other words. And already I could hear her eager shuffling steps in the next room. Still wearing her outdoor clothes, she had not found time to change. She brought in a nightshirt that she had warmed before the fire for her husband to put on. "He's fallen asleep," she said, smiling and shaking her head, when she found us sitting so still. And with the infinite trustfulness of the innocent she took up the same hand that I had held a moment before with such fear and repugnance, kissed it playfully, and, how could we 3 others have borne the sight, and moved, yawned loudly, allowed his nightshirt to be put on, endured with a mixture of annoyance and irony his wife's tender reproaches for having overstrained himself by taking such a long walk, and strangely enough said in reply, to provide no doubt a different explanation for his having fallen asleep, something about feeling bored. Then, so as not to catch cold by going through the draughty passage into a different room, he lay down for the time being in his son's bed. His head was bedded down beside his son's feet on 2 cushions hastily brought by his wife. After all that had gone before, I found nothing particularly odd in that. Then he asked for the evening paper, opened it without paying any attention to his guests, but did not read it, only glancing through it here and there, and made several very unpleasant observations on our offers, observations which showed astonishing shrewdness, while he waved his free hand disdainfully, and by clicking his tongue indicated that our business methods had left a bad taste in his mouth. The agent could not refrain from making one or two untimely remarks. No doubt he felt in his insensitive way that some compensation was due to him after what had happened, but his way of securing it was the worst he could have chosen. I said goodbye as soon as I could. I felt almost grateful to the agent. If he had not been there, I would not have had the resolution to leave so soon. In the lobby I met Frau N again. At the sight of that pathetic figure I said impulsively that she reminded me a little of my mother. And as she remained silent I added, whatever people say, she could do wonders. Things that we destroyed she could make whole again. I lost her when I was still a child. I had spoken with deliberate slowness and distinctness, for I assumed the old lady was hard of hearing. But she must have been quite deaf, for she asked without transition, "And how does my husband look to you?" From a few parting words I noticed, moreover, that she confused me with the agent. I like to think that otherwise she would have been more forthcoming. Then I descended the stairs. The descent was more tiring than the ascent had been, and not even that had been easy. Oh, how many business calls come to nothing, and yet one must keep going. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to subscribe for more.